is my privilege and pleasure to host a podcast interview and conversation with two of the co-authors of a recently published book titled Christianity and Asian Religion in Vancouver. I have Albert Chu, Reverend Albert Chu, and I have Dr. Ross Lockhart. The Reverend Dr. Ross Lockhart is the Dean of St. Andrew's Hall, the Presbyterian Church in Canada College at the University of British Columbia. And I used to hail from that region when I went to seminary in Vancouver. Ross is also the professor of mission studies at Vancouver School of Theology. Um, Albert Chu is the lead pastor of the Tapestry Church, a multi-campus church in the Lower Mainland. And Albert is also the director of the Center for Missional Leadership at St. Andrew's Hall. So again, welcome Albert and welcome Ross. I'm really excited to talk about this recent publication, Christianity and Asian Religion in Vancouver. You and I have spoken a bit in the past. I'm a big fan of the Center for Missional Leadership and what you all are doing through St. Andrew's Hall. And having lived and studied and worshiped in Vancouver, I personally am invested in the research project and the book. And so perhaps we could begin with let's begin with some of the backstory here. Ross and Albert, how did you come to know each other along with Jason Biasi, who is the other co-author? How did you all first meet?
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you for having us. It's a joy, and just as you've been kind to say words about our center, we're really excited about the work you're doing at PTS with your center and the focus that you have. So, joy to be with you, David. Wow, Albert, who wants to go
Yeah.
first? And we
Phew.
could make up a story. We could make
Yeah,
up a
I know
story
we
about
could.
how we met,
Yes,
some
that's right.
overseas location.
Was it at brunch?
That's right. Yeah, no, let me think about how we met. I think I spoke at a Presbyterian kind of presbytery meeting in
Yep.
which Ross was present. I gave the story of the tapestry, and like you mentioned, we are a multi-site church, and how we developed into a church plant 19 years ago this month, and how we have eventually become 4 campuses and so forth. So I spoke about that, and then Ross reached out to me. I attended a Center for Missional Leadership gathering with Daryl Guter, which was amazing because we all love Daryl. And then I was on sabbatical. Ross was leading a trip to Greece, and we hooked up in the Mediterranean in Greece with our lovely wives, and we hit it off. And ever since then, we've been friends. And when Ross was the director for the Center for Missional Leadership, he became dean of St. Andrew's Hall. He needed someone to be the director, and I was looking for, I don't know, more work. Is that even possible? I did not want more work, but yeah, I love what the center does, and I said yes. And so yeah, we've been good since then. And it is because of that position that I met Jason. But I don't know what the origin story is between Ross and Jason, so I'm curious to hear that.
Wow. I love origin stories, and that was a really lovely way to describe it, Albert. The other thing I would say about Albert joining us at the Center for Missional Leadership at St. Andrew's Hall is you're right. Albert does not need one or two
No.
more things to do. He's super busy. However, when we started to explore the possibility of Albert taking on that role, it really was a sense of giving back in a different way. So, Albert, I can brag a bit on Albert and what God has done through his ministry. I do hope in this podcast we'll hear a little bit more about the Tapestry ministry because it's directly connected to Asian Christianity in Vancouver. But Albert, and I think a lot of pastors listening to this podcast will get it. You know, you keep your head down, you're working hard. Congregational ministry is all consuming. In our tradition in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, I often I'm serving right now as an interim moderator, so essentially de facto pastor of a congregation. I get it. Congregational ministry can be all consuming. I think as Albert and I were talking a little bit, he has so much wisdom and so much experience. He wanted to share that, almost package it differently. And so because the Center for Missional Leadership is located within an academic institution, but the CML is focused on congregations and its leaders. It's been this sweet spot to bring together a lot of the relational connections including another member of our team, Tim Dickow, who is equally well networked in Vancouver, Grandview Church pastor for 30 years. We have a group of folks who love Jesus, love his church in context. And so it's been really great. Someone else who loves Jesus and loves the church in context is our friend Jason Biasi, who I've met, well, several years ago. We were best of friends on faculty at Vancouver School of Theology. And the origin story, if it's okay, David, to go there for the book that we're discussing today, is actually connected with Jason. So pre-pandemic, I received a grant from a Canadian Presbyterian funding agency to do some research on churches in the Pacific Northwest. And the origin story of that project that was published as Better Than Brunch, Missional Churches in Cascadia, was to build upon a less known work than Missional Church. Of course, the three of us on this call, and I hope many listening to the podcast, are huge fans of Daryl Guter, who has an incredible legacy within the PCUSA, Princeton Theological Seminary, and so many other places. Upon Daryl's retirement from Princeton, we somehow managed to get him to say yes, and he became the senior fellow of the Center for Missional Leadership. But it was Daryl who alerted me to the follow-up book to Missional Church in 1998 that he served as editor, Treasure in Clay Jars. Now, I had read it years ago, and essentially it was, that's great. We love Missional Church and we love the theology. Does it actually work? Can you point us to anywhere that this is taking place? And so that follow-up book a few years after Missional Church, 3, 4, 5 years later, was sending missiologists out to research, and they developed characteristics or patterns. So the work that Jason and I did was to say, are there similar patterns in the Pacific Northwest? We began with the work from Treasure in Clay Jars, but after time we set aside as researchers. And from that work, we profiled missional churches and their characteristics in the Pacific Northwest. But to our conversation today, many of the churches that fit the missional characteristics were what might be called Pan-Asian congregations. So not necessarily ethnic-specific congregations, but churches, much like Tapestry Church with Albert Chu, where they're not ethnic specific. Any ethnicity is welcome, of course, but there tends to be a clustering of Asian believers of different ethnic backgrounds. So from there, we want to do a follow-up project, and that's where the genesis of this book came from. And maybe, David, you have further questions, or if Albert wants to share more on the actual book.
I do have more questions. That is a great tee up, Ross, going from the missional church, which I read cover to cover in seminary when I was in Vancouver, and to meet Daryl Guter in the flesh at Princeton Seminary and to work very, very closely with him was a really providential happening. And so this genealogy of concepts going from the missional church to Treasure in Clays of Jar 2, the brunch book, Better Than Brunch, missional churches in Cascadia. That's extremely helpful. For our viewers who may not be familiar with the Pacific Northwest, nor with Vancouver, and maybe I can kind of give the microphone to Albert. Can you just describe a little bit of the Metro Vancouver area and some of the demographic composition as well as recent and relevant history?
Oh, where do you even begin with that in terms of that? I think the good way of looking and understanding the Lower Mainland is just if you think about demographically highly urban. I don't know what the actual stats is, but I think 50-60% of people live in not detached housing, but live in condos and townhouses and so forth. So Vancouver itself is highly urban. In terms of Asian, I think I don't know what the stats are, but in Richmond, which is a city which I live in, which is just south of Metro Vancouver, I think the last stats are 72% are Asian. So you can imagine a population where it's highly Asian, highly urban. And of course, the one thing that we'll allude to, especially with the secularization theory, is it's post-Christian. It's most people, the fastest growing religion here up in Canada, especially the Lower Mainland, are the nuns, who
Mhm.
put down none as in no religious affiliation or belief on their census. So that gives you a snapshot of what Vancouver is: highly urban, highly Asian, and highly irreligious. Irreligious, but not necessarily unspiritual. I think that's one thing you have to note, is that there's a there's a spirituality here. Um, a lot of it because it's beautiful and it's green, a lot of creation kind of spirituality. And I think Ross, you have a fancy term for it: reverential something, something, something. What's your fancy term
Oh,
for it? I can't even remember what
it
it was.
it's so good. I know we're supposed to be plugging our book, but all of us inhale books at the rate that we're always plugging others. So there is a delightful publication this year, last year, pardon me, by UBC Press, called Religion at the Edge. And it's a multi-year ethnographic research project led by a number of scholars, including Paul Bramadat, who's a religious studies scholar at the University of Victoria. And while some have claimed that environmentalism is the default kind of religion of this area, that Paul Bramadat takes it a little bit further. And he suggests that from his research, the default way to describe people's spirituality is reverential naturalism.
Hmm.
Reverential naturalism. So that no matter what people believe or say they don't believe, that a common held value in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, is that there is a deep sense of reverence for nature, not creation in a theology of creation way from a Christian perspective, but nature. And I think we found that to be true. And David, I'm sure in your time up here in the Pacific Northwest, you experienced that kind of element as well.
Oh, yeah. I spent many a times at, is it Mountain Equipment Co-op?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
I love my mech fleece.
Yes, that's right.
And,
Yeah.
bought all sorts of mountain biking gear for
Oh
my
yeah.
mountain biking excursion in the lovely, lands, especially the endowment lands where UBC is. That
Mm.
brings back a lot of fond memories.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
yeah.
before you go on, David, one thing that encapsulates for me at the Lower Mainland is, I can't remember who said it, but something about how high places of any city kind of mark the idolatry or the idols of the city. So, Toronto in Canada, or New York, or, for the American listeners, skyscrapers, and especially owned by banks, tend to be the high places. Those are the highest buildings in town. And so you have an idea that banking, finance is the idolatry of the city. In Vancouver, the two tallest buildings are the Shangri-La, which is a hotel, and what used to be the Trump Tower, which is also a hotel. And so this idolatry of leisure, of comfort, of extravagance. And of course, the high place in Vancouver is something called Grouse Mountain. And David, if you remember, the Grouse Grind
Hike.
is your entrance into Vancouver. It's this 800-meter natural stairmaster you have to hike up. And people always say you're not a Vancouverite unless you've done the Grouse Grind. And of course, the next question is, how fast did you do it, right? What was your time? Because that was a big deal. So leisure, I mean, come on. Lululemon and Arc'teryx came out of Vancouver. It just gives you an idea of what Vancouver is about. So I hope that's helpful.
Interesting.
Well
That
said.
is. That is. That
And
is.
and now, David, you should ask Albert what his best time is for the gross grind. He's
That's gonna
very
sidetrack
fast.
us. That's
Yes, that's right.
we'll
Let's get
keep
back at
we'll
yes.
follow that up afterwards.
Yes.
So Ross, you mentioned something really interesting from the treasure and clay jars
Hmm.
identified certain characteristics of missional churches.
Right.
And then the book that you all co-authored began specifically looking at these missional churches, which happen to be pan-ethnic. So
Mhm.
say more about the connection and transition from the Treasure in Clay Jars book to
Yeah.
the Christianity and Asian Religion in Vancouver book.
Yeah, very much. So, the research for Better Than Brunch, and the language of Better Than Brunch was a PCUSA pastor in Portland who, I won't use the language, it was a bit foul, but said basically in the Pacific Northwest, unless your worship and your Christian community are better than brunch. Well, I won't finish the sentence. That's where he went to another place. But all that to say that people's default setting in a secular society is to value a communal gathering like brunch on a Sunday morning rather than public worship. And so, as we started to kind of peel back the layers on the data that we found interviewing pastors in these churches, we very much noticed that once we were in the pandemic, we wanted to do something closer to home. And so we focused just on Vancouver because it seems crazy even now, but like for the first time in our lives, we couldn't cross the US border. It was the most bizarre experience during the pandemic. We're used to going to Costco in Bellingham all the time, and we couldn't get down there. So we thought, okay, we have to tighten up the research area. We have to keep it to Vancouver, primarily do interviews online. But we wanted to make a shift and a deliberate shift from clergy focus that Better Than Brunch had been to layperson focused. So we wanted to test in a new area to do interviews with Asian Christian lay people to ask questions around how they became a Christian, to ask them questions around their immigration history, to ask them questions around their vocation and how the work they do is influenced or not through their Christian convictions. And so we started to develop kind of a loose interview guide on those themes and really let the interviews take us in the directions that we felt that the interviewee wanted to lead us. And so we did most of those interviews together. Sometimes we record one and share them with the other two authors. But over time, we were able to build up quite an interesting set of interviews to go through and to start our coding.
That's great. Albert, did you want to add anything?
No, not really. So I think all in total, there were about 40 people we interviewed. And again, just laypersons telling their story. And I came late in the game. Again, Jason and Ross, having worked on Better Than Brunch, were starting to move into this. And I think they realized as they were unpacking the data and all this sort of stuff, it might be good to have an Asian person look at the interviews, maybe provide some insight and also co-write with them. And so they invited me into this. And this was before I think I joined the Center for Missional Leadership. So this was at the beginning. And, just reading these stories was so meaningful because there were basically 40 testimonies about how they came to faith, the difference their faith makes in terms of their vocation and their work. What's it mean to grow up with these dual or mixed identities of being Asian and yet Canadian and also Christian? And one of the things that we've seen, so we took these interviews and we've kind of told their stories in the book. So not all of them made it into the book. So maybe we had 20 people or so with their kind of mini, we've taken some of their testimonies and provided some of that content in the book. But time and time again, the people that were in the book, they have said, oh, it is so amazing that my story is being told. We hope that it's encouraging. And so as much as this book does provide some kind of, theological stance or some ideas and stuff, in many ways, it's kind of like a book of stories, a book of narratives. And there aren't that many books that tell the story of Asian Christians, especially in Canada. And so, yeah, it's really neat that we can do that for a lot of Asian Christians.
I definitely want to start discussing the major findings or themes
Right.
of the book, and I have the table of contents in front of me on my other screen. But before we do that, just clarify for me with the interview sampling, are you targeting missional churches and then a lot of the missional churches in the Lower Mainland happen to be Pan-Asian? Or was the focus always from the start a focus on Pan-Asian churches and interviewing Asian Christians in particular? Sort out the kind of thought process here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think While the Better Than Brunch book was focused on some of the conclusions from both Missional Church and Treasure and Clay Jars, this book was not specifically focused on the theme of missional theology or missional church. It's more the outcome from Better Than Brunch was the discovery that many of the churches that fit the characteristics we developed in that book were Pan-Asian. And so then we wanted to go in a different direction and say, let's start having conversations with Asian Christian lay people, many of whom do belong to those Pan-Asian churches, Tapestry, as we've mentioned, but also 10th Church under Ken Shigematsu, Fraserlands, and so forth. But some of the folks we interviewed are part of ethnic specific Chinese Presbyterian, Taiwanese Presbyterian, and it was more about their experience as an Asian Christian believer when they came to faith, how their faith impacts their life and their work that we were interested in this project.
Oh, that's fantastic. So let's jump into the book much more explicitly. And you did all you both of you along with Jason conducted interviews, and I imagine certain conversations may stick out more than others. And I'd love for both of you to share some of the leading takeaways you got from the research, the writing, and the final form of the book. So I'm not asking for a global summary. I'm just saying what spoke to you that you really retained from the entire process of interviewing, researching, writing, and publishing.
So good, Albert. Did you want to kick us off?
Oh, again, these are big questions, David. I don't even know where to begin.
Let the spirit guide. Let the
Yeah,
spirit
let the
guide.
spirit guide. That's right. I think one of the ones that really struck me, or an ongoing theme, was having talking to a lot of these Asians and just the whole question of identity, just
Mhm.
coming over again. So, we interviewed one person who was Japanese, uh, Canadian, and a Christian, and just how questions about identity, who he was, and so forth. And so there's one chapter called Juxing, and Juxing is a Cantonese slang for bamboo, right? So the idea is that someone who is, in your case, American, um, Chinese, uh, there used to be the term banana, but in Cantonese, it's the term juxing. It's the idea of bamboo. So, as you know, a bamboo rod is compartmentalized. There's no water that flows in and out. So it's this. They're not really Canadian, and they're not really Chinese. They don't really fit. And time again, what we heard from people was more of a hyphenated identity, where they are Chinese Canadian, where they do have this separate kind of identity, which they kind of have to play, and they're trying to take the best of both worlds. So that's a double identity. But then what happens when you add being Christian into that identity? And so it was really interesting how many people, as they continued to be interviewed about how Christianity became the identity that grounded them, that helped them understand not only what it meant to be Canadian, but what it meant to be Chinese. So the other thing that I take away from that is, I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, which is just directly above Montana for people who are listening that don't know their Canadian geography, and it's cold. And I grew up there in the 70s, and I was pretty much the only Chinese kid in the neighborhood other than my brother. And I was picked on, there's prejudice, there's discrimination and stuff. And I always felt like an outsider. Felt like an outsider because of my Chineseness, because I was Chinese. No one, there weren't very many of us. They all thought I did Kung Fu, so I stayed away from fights, but they made fun of my smelly food and, all of this kind of stuff. I always felt like an outsider. I am once again feeling like an outsider, but not because of my Chineseness, but because of being a Christian. So,
Hmm.
which is a really interesting way of maybe my understanding of being a minority presence as being Chinese growing up. The question is, and I don't have an answer, is it helpful? And people like us, like yourself, David, does that help us become better Christians, a minority presence here in a kind of post-Christian secular society? So it's a question that we ended up with in chapter 6, I think, and when we asked those questions. So that's
Well, thank
probably my biggest takeaway, just the whole idea of identity, where we fit, How is it helpful? How do we move forward with this kind of hyphenated identity?
That's super helpful, Albert. Thank you. I'm gonna have to take a look at chapter 6 more carefully. Ross, how about for you?
Yeah, so much richness in the conversations. I think what I found interesting was as a missiologist was the changing face of Christianity through immigrant culture that people reported. So a concrete example of this would be one of the folks that we interviewed is a local anchor of our CTV news here. And she also provided the afterword, Mijang Lee. And her story was not unique. There were many who described this, but her story stood out in that she came to Canada as a Korean immigrant and was involved a little bit for a time at a Korean United Church with her family, mostly because it was a place of arrival and shared culture and language. But the family drifted from that, and it was less about a religious engagement, more about a cultural engagement for a short season. But then it was an older German couple in the neighborhood where she grew up who invited Mijang and her sister to go to their church and actually drove around the neighborhood picking up kids to take them to Sunday school to like an old school German, I think it was a German Baptist immigrant church that you can imagine was starting to age out, which is a note that we need to return to the tapestry story in a few minutes, was starting to age out from kind of a franchise of, European Christendom church plant from a couple of, at least 100 years earlier. But it was being transformed into an Asian congregation. But Mijang spoke so kindly and warmly about this older couple who felt compelled to invite those from a different cultural tradition to hear the gospel and to know Jesus, and who, with some level of sacrifice, engaged in that as a ministry. And then eventually, of course, the church was no longer a German immigrant, but became an Asian congregation. And so that kind of encapsulated for me part of the story of what I think God is doing in Vancouver. And that is, and it certainly would be a thesis in the book, is that while we talk a lot about church decline, and it's true in Canada, the Christian church in every possible variation appears to be declining in numbers. But our argument is that in addition to decline, it's also changing. And the story of change is not often nuanced in the media. It's only about the number of church buildings that are being closed, sold, and turned into condos. And so if we keep looking east to Europe and that legacy of the church, I think if we turn around, we miss what God is doing with immigration patterns and new believers from the West or from Asia.
That is incredibly rich. I want to let's talk about the book, but I want to situate the book in some of the framing comments that Ross provided about church decline more broadly in Canadian society. I think there's almost identical patterns in the US social context with the declining significance of churches, with the changing patterns of churches. And again, how immigration kind of fuels the changing face of Christianity in Canada. And in the US, it's what we call the post 1965 flows of immigration, especially from south and west of the border in the US context. So here's what I'd like Albert to do is I want to hear more about Tapestry as a church plant, as a kind of case study, and how Tapestry may confirm or sort of contest some of the themes in the book. I imagine more confirming than contesting. But Albert, as you illustrate examples from your experience and ministry through Tapestry, tie it into this notion of church decline and church change.
Yeah, I think one of the things before I begin is ethnic churches continue to grow here in Vancouver, period, because immigration has not stopped. You had post 65, 68, you had all these people from Hong Kong coming. And so the growth of the Chinese ethnic churches, you have then, the scare of 97 and even more immigration coming. You have, China opening its borders more. Many ways, the growing churches here in the Lower Mainland are ethnic churches. The largest church in the Lower Mainland are Korean. There's a church of 3,000 plus in Surrey, for example. The Catholic Church is growing quite a bit here and mostly fueled by Filipino immigrants that have come. So that's one thing that's true, is that ethnic churches are certainly fast growing. So I grew up in an ethnic church. I grew up in a Chinese church and so forth. And I had this kind of kingdom idea of church being more than just belonging to one ethnic group, but really for the neighborhood, really wanted to be something that was multiracial, kingdom orientated, inclusive, and so forth. So I left the Chinese church and was called 19 years ago to plant a church in Richmond. And I didn't purposely plan a Pan-Asian church. I didn't purposely plan to a second gen Asian church or anything like that. I wanted to plant a church for the neighborhood. And that's what we did. And so the Tapestry has always wanted to live up to its name, to weave diverse people into a fabric of a Christian community with the fabric of Christ being interwoven throughout it. And so that's what we did 19 years ago. And we started welcoming people of all sorts in the neighborhood. What is interesting is that 19 years ago, if you looked at the membership of our church, I'd say it would be 50-50. It would be maybe 50% Anglo or, not Asian, and 50% Asian. And when we talk about Asian, we're talking about Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, Laotian, just across the board. But now, if you look at the same congregation in Richmond, it's about 80-20, 80% Asian, 20% not. So some of these people do come from the Far East, who come in and they look for a place to kind of immerse themselves into Canadian culture. Everything we do is in English. And so, they come, they want their kids to be involved and so forth. But yes, we tend to have a number of second generation or, Christians come in a sense that they grew up in ethnic churches and now they have left, and second gen folks are starting to come to the TAP and attend. So I think that has fueled our growth. We are now 4 campuses. A lot of second gen Asians do attend. And then, that's often fueled that because I think they have felt not at home in their ethnic church that they grew up in. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. And I have a kind of a related but slightly distinct question for Ross. But Ross, if you wanted to jump in on any of what Albert said, please go for it.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously Albert's story that he's lived and breathed for 19 years. I mean, to connect to the story that I was sharing with the German immigrant church, Albert, did you want to say a bit more about how your experience of Tapestry and the birth of that congregation was connected to a story of decline in a European congregation?
I can, a little bit of that. So when I came, one of the reasons why I came to Richmond was First Richmond CRC, a predominantly Dutch congregation that had started 40, 50 years ago when they first immigrated to Canada, was on the decline. So they maybe had 20, 30 people all over the age of 65 and in serious decline. And so in the wisdom of the denomination, they said, well, let's start a church in the neighborhood with the hopes that we can take over the building. And so that was the hope. Of course, that was not met with open arms. In the end, our parent church, which is this older Dutch CRC church, wanted to sell the building to developers in order to make it into a row of townhouses, which is very short-sighted because here in the Lower Mainland, you can't subdivide for religious assembly anymore. So you would lose a church in that neighborhood forever. So we petitioned, we picketed, we prayed. And then in the end, they sold us the building for $1.4 million that we had to buy the church building from our parent church belonging to the same denomination. So that was one of distrust, one of not sure. I always wanted to show a picture of them when they first came, when they first launched the church, and our picture, and said, it's the same picture. It's church. It's just that the immigrants look different. But I don't think they understood that. So compare and contrast that to the story that Ross said with Mi Jung Lee. Compare it and contrast it to, so there's this lovely story of Pacific Grace Mennonite Brethren Church where we do talk about it in the book, where it's this German congregation, Pacific Grace, ethnically German, that begin to do outreach to their neighborhood. And all these Asians had moved into their neighborhood in East Vancouver. And it was a growing kind of ministry that they had. So in the end, they decided that the German ethnic part of that church would dissolve. But then they gifted the building, gifted and prayed and supported and encouraged the growth of the Chinese congregation. The Chinese congregation moved into the building, and since then has planted 6 other churches in the Lower Mainland. So it's interesting, the contrast between the two, in a sense that we still find some immigrant churches, ethnic churches, European ethnic churches that are very hesitant, not welcoming of new immigrants. And then you have others that are very open-handed, welcoming, and want to continue ministry. So we don't really delve into it too much in the book, but it's interesting, the comparison between the two of what that looks like. And then the question that comes up to me is, these ethnic churches, 40, 50 years down the road, or even now, as their kids are leaving, what is their posture? Are they going to become more ethnic and not gift these buildings to the second gen or other immigrants that are coming? Are they going to relive that history, or are they going to be open-handed and see the gospel and the kingdom being not about ethnicity, but about mission?
All right. So I want to identify what immigration gives, immigration can take away if immigration doesn't continue as it has, which raises the question about successive generations and
Right.
how the church adapts to their changing needs. I want to kind of eventually get there, but let me just stay on the topic of immigration. And what I'm hearing so far is immigration is one of the drivers, a significant driver of the growth of these churches, especially these ethnic churches or Pan-Asian churches. Got it. I'm thinking now back, and this is from the 90s, as many years ago, several decades ago, the phrase Burnaby Holy Lands. So you have churches like ECBC, and right next to it, there's a Sikh temple. So I imagine there are many kind of migrants from Asia, not all of whom either affiliate with Christianity, but may affiliate with a Buddhist temple, a Sikh temple, Hindu religion, etc. Ross, what are you seeing about migration and religious affiliation outside of Christianity? So, in other words, if
Mm.
we're saying immigration is one of the drivers for expanded church life,
Mhm.
is there something analogous with these other religious institutions or not? And I'm just curious.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's a great question. It certainly is outside of my research area. I can tell you what my hunch is,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that is that from officiating Christian Sikh weddings and so forth, over the last several years, that I think that there is a greater cultural attachment to immigrants who are coming to Canada, that they may see the Sikh temple or the Buddhist temple as much an ethnic association as a religious one, where I don't think you see that in the same way with Christianity. That for those who come already Christian to Canada as an Asian immigrant, they are proactive in seeking out association with fellow Christians. And then for many who come not Christian, if it's going to last, if it's going to stick, again, think of that example of Korean immigrants who come for a short period of time because the language is the same culture and then they drift away. If it's going to stick, than it is about a transformative, personal experience of Christian faith that often is begins with meeting a need, but goes beyond that. So, for example, in the book, we had a number of folks describe arriving in Canada from Asia and being met at the airport by Asian Christian believers who had set up a booth to welcome them. So, the flight from Korea arrives, and there's a Korean Christian fellowship waiting to answer questions and to orientate people. And oh, by the way, we have this gathering of students on Thursday nights. Please come. And so, that it's meeting a need, and yet it's more than just kind of cultural association. There's a deep evangelical impulse that goes with it. So I wouldn't want to kind of speak in any definitive way about other religious expressions, but I am curious about the cultural connection,
Mhm.
and by that I think that's legitimate and real and deep. But I'm not sure about if it's analogous to kind of deep faith based allegiance, or whether it's more just kind of default cultural alignment.
Right. Well, this is where my theological antenna get raised, and I want to follow up with what Ross has just been addressing, which is what is it about Christianity that makes it apt or fitting for this type of engagement with, on the one hand, immigration, and then kind of identity formation that is transformative and personal, right? So
Mhm.
I take it we've been putting on our sociological, ethnographic, we're kind of describing things, but let's go one step further and say, what are some of the theological insights generated from these testimonies and oral history interviews that say something about the substance of Christianity? And
Mm.
I welcome both of your responses. Like, what does the book tell us about Christianity and Christian faith?
Hmm. Great question.
Because I'm just thinking about again the comment where on the one hand these German immigrants and other European immigrants their churches decline, but then
Mhm.
that's not the death knell of Christianity. That is simply the opportunity for Christianity to take on a different form, thus
Yeah.
the changing face of Christianity. So right there as a theologian, I'm thinking, oh, Christianity is a faith that is adaptive. Like
Hmm.
there's something, and we could just call that missional. it it has this fittingness for different people in different places at different times that
Hmm.
suits different needs while maintaining a kind of recognizable Christian identity.
Hmm.
I'm thinking that is fascinating. As a
Hmm.
sociological phenomenon, that is fascinating. As a religious phenomenon, that's fascinating. Um, and those are just some of my immediate thoughts. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a great question, David, because of course the dilemma is, and we can all think of examples where people want to hold on to or to retain elements, expressions of Christianity that they believe might be core, but actually are cultural and are passing, right? So, for an example, would be what if we went to those former German immigrant churches and they were still singing songs in German? That would be unusual, right? So how is the faith transmitted and translated through new cultural expressions? What I would say is that I think from our interviews, there was a very clear sense that there was an evangelical impulse, both from other Christian believers and from European heritage based Christians who actually had a big impact on the lives of the folks we were interviewing. And so there was this desire to pass on the goodness of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and almost releasing outcomes, trusting that, as you've said, in a missional sense, that God is active, that God is sovereign, that God is redeeming, and that God is forming and reforming the church in new expressions. One thing I should say is that a particular element of the church in the Pacific Northwest, and this would come to us from folks like Lynn Marks, who is a historian at the University of Victoria. She has a delightful book called Infidels and the Damned Churches by UBC Press, a settler religion and irreligion in 19th century British Columbia. She makes the argument, along with others, that Christendom was never fully established on the West Coast, that this region is one in which primarily young men came in the 19th century to make their fame and fortune, to make it rich in mining and so forth. Today it's real estate and IT and Hollywood North, but that it's an extract economy, and therefore people putting down deep roots and aligning with religious expression was unusual. And so what that has led to, and I think this is an important element, is it's led to isolation and loneliness, the Seattle freeze, the Vancouver chill, and so forth. And so I think Christian communities offer a response to that isolation. And I think we detected that in some of the interviews, that for immigrants already feeling isolated, that Christian community was one of those places that they were both received, but also were given agency to shape and change the Christian community itself. So you arrive and it's a European immigrant heritage church. You don't have to become a European heritage immigrant to remain, but the community would be reshaped based on who is present, as long as the focus was on Jesus.
All right.
Yeah, that's good. I'm just going to pick up on what Ross said,
Yes.
because I
Mhm.
agree. Adaptive, missional, all this sort of stuff. What was interesting as we were talking to these Asian Christians was the high value of community and being relational and being family. And so there is kind of, there's this paradigm that we often work with, that the West tends to be more individualistic, tends to be more um, just a personal relationship with God, all that sort of stuff. But with people from the East, they're more communal, more social, more family orientated and stuff like this. So there is a sense that a lot of potentially second gen Christians stay in the church. They might not go to their parents' church, but they stay in the church because to leave the church would their parents would lose faith, would lose face, and so they've kept on going to church and so forth. So I'm wondering, something that we've learned about Christianity in this experience is time and time again through the interviews, the high desire for community, of being in a relationship, of being a part of a new family. We've heard that language quite a bit. So yeah, I'm not sure what it says, but certainly it shows a little bit about Christianity moving away from the hyper individualism that kind of marked Christianity in the last few decades, and to something a little more holistic.
So the book, in your research, the image that comes to my mind is a canary in a coal mine. These are sort of early indicators. And I think the Lower Mainland, as a post Christendom context, is already a kind of crystal ball of sorts, to speak that way. And so I want to talk about trends for the future, both with respect to post Christendom Christianity, given the realities of global migration, and using the Lower Mainland as a laboratory of sorts. All right. And I think talking to leadership from the Center for Missional Leadership is incredibly helpful for having this kind of um, experimental sort of perspective. But I want to ask Albert this question about the next generation. So you've got first gen ethnic churches that were either Mandarin speaking, Cantonese speaking, Korean speaking, that capture the kind of pressing needs, especially existential social needs of first generation immigrants. You've got the development of English speaking Asian churches and ministries, as well as these Pan Asian churches. And then we're now talking about Gen Z and how their culture, their outlook will have evolved even further from the first and the second generation. So I have a 15-year-old who's a sophomore in high school. He's part of this Gen Z sort of demographic. And in 10 years, he'll be a young adult. And so what what are these Pan Asian churches going to do in 10 years when the options for Gen Z will only increase. Not church not only has to be better than brunch, it's got to be better than mountain biking. It's got to be better than Fortnite. It's got to be better than a Taylor Swift concert, right?
Never.
Nothing
How's
is
that
better.
possible?
Nothing is better, David, than a Taylor Swift concert, except the return of Jesus Christ.
There you go. I am saying the Eras Tour is a fascinating sociological
Yeah.
experiment because it is a worship experience. She
Yeah.
is borrowing the best practices from what churches offer as communal. There is praise, there's dance, there's telling stories. And when she's going acoustic, there's a sing and response. She looks like a worship leader. So, but it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for what is capturing the zeitgeist with Gen Z, their tastes, their sort of affiliation, and I think most importantly, their passions. One of the things I notice is it's not cool for the younger generation to be excited about anything. And yet, look at what they get excited about, right? And oftentimes it's not church. And what is our youth ministry? What is our outreach ministry? What is our pastoral care and our discipleship? What is it going to need to um, develop? How is it going to innovate? I don't know if these are the right words, but I'm assuming if Albert and I, as kind of like I'm 51, like we helped develop a church that was a faith of our own. What does it mean for the next generation, Gen Z, to develop a faith for their own? And so, Albert, do you just share some of your ruminations here?
That's the $1,000,000 question. Like, what happens to the next generation? I mean, what happens to the church in the future and stuff? So I don't have an answer to that. I do think, though, I think our ecclesiology has to change. I think we have to shift in how we understand what it means to be the gathered people. Because I think what you said, the next generation coming into this worship gathering where we've been doing the same thing for generations, I don't think that's going to be it anymore. I wonder if the gathered people are smaller missional communities, whether it is very house church based. I don't have an answer, but I think that might be the way that it's going. I think the big church gathering, there's a place for that, as Taylor Swift shows us. But I'm not sure if that's the weekly rhythm going on in the future. I think,
Wow.
yeah, I'm wondering if we have big questions about ecclesiology coming up in the future.
Ross, did you want to jump in on any of this?
Well, I love this conversation, and thanks to Albert for sharing that there is no like concrete answer. Although if there is, I think Albert would be the person to deliver that. So no, I love this more porous, more flexible ecclesiology. And yet underneath I think are still some pretty core questions that were part of this project, right? So questions around identity, around belonging
Hmm.
and community. What you're describing, I have teenagers in my house as well, David, and I don't understand their culture at all. I just feel so old. And you're right, we have to be asking these questions, but I'll give a concrete example. I do some coaching with our largest Presbyterian summer camp. It's located on the beautiful shores of Lake Huron in Ontario. A great facility, really a large, now maybe not compared to American summer camps. I know those are bigger, but for Canada, this is a really large one. And the director there, a graduate of Vancouver School of Theology, where I teach, has been identifying for years that their young adult staff who came up as campers all the way through LIT and work, once they're done, they really struggle to find a Christian community to belong to. And this is more than just you're a cultural Christian and so you don't want to go to church. No, these are folks for whom Jesus is Lord, and they try and find a church community outside of camp season and they can't plug in. So they've started something, a ministry, a church plant called We Kirk and the Cedars, where they have outdoor worship once a month and invite camp staff and former campers and families and anyone to come back. And it's been impressive to see that ministry grow. But they're asking good questions like, why will people drive 2 hours to camp to have an outdoor worship service, including in the winter, and a meal that follows? What is it? It's about a theology of creation. It's about a sense of sacred space. It's about community where they're known. So why can we not replicate that within traditional congregational life? It's a struggle. These are big, big issues. And then you lay on the overall decline narrative and the financial pressure that a lot of congregations are in. My curiosity is, are congregations places where that kind of innovation can take place, or are they so stressed post COVID with fewer numbers and fewer resources that the risk that would be required in reshaping ecclesiology may be too much for some of our congregations, not all, but some of our congregations to take on?
Well, I think these prospective and aspirational meditations are a good note to conclude this podcast conversation. But I also feel like it's teed up our next podcast conversation. Um, I'm thinking the themes that are emerging for our perhaps next conversation would include post Christendom Christianity. Is it a decline? Is it emergent? Is it in full swing? The role of immigration, and then new models of ministry, ecclesiology, discipleship, and outreach. Like, what are some new wineskins, and what are some examples as you two start proliferating these? And as we talk about this in podcast form, maybe we can help kind of create a conversation that stimulates innovation and out of the box thinking. Albert, Ross, thank you for your labors in producing Christianity and Asian religion in Vancouver. I've learned so much from both of you, and I appreciate the time and sharing with our audience all that you've learned through your research and ministry.
Thanks, David. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, David, blessings on your ministry and all our friends at
Mm.
PTS, and look forward to our next conversation, especially if it includes more Taylor Swift.